Dr. Cadell Last, it is so good to see you today. Thank you so much for your time. I am so thrilled. Your work on your thesis, the paper we're going to talk about on the cosmic evolutionary philosophy and a dialectical approach to technological singularity. I've enjoyed the philosophy of lack series we did together. The recent talk you did with Pascal and Bruce was awesome on religion and lack, your Freud series, Hegel. It's just such a delight to see you today. Thank you so much for being here, Cadell.
Thanks for having me, Daniel, and always great to talk to you, of course.
It's a delight, a delight. You know, I was thinking, I used to work as a photographer, and one of my favorite things to do, and I haven't been on an airplane very much, but I was once in an airplane going to Chengdu. And, I love looking out the window and taking photographs of different territories and different things. What always struck me is how, from that height, these very concrete farmlands looked like abstractions, like abstract paintings. They were so weird and they were so strange. And yet they weren't abstract. They were composed of the most concrete phenomenon in the world, right? They were formed of farms and houses and fields and different things like that. And what was so funny to me is, I guess I remember being in that airplane and thinking, wow, very often what we call abstract as a kind of othering, as a kind of like, oh, it's kind of out there, actually is just a perspective of a phenomenon that can be very close to us, that we can be living in every single day, but we're just viewing it from a certain scope. I did this with my kids the other day. We got on the sidewalk and I said, all right, Grace, get your face as close to the sidewalk as you can. And suddenly the sidewalk's like an abstract painting, because you have a scope where you get really, really close. And then it looks like an abstract painting, but then you pull out and it's just a sidewalk. It's nothing of a big deal. And yet you walk on it every single day. Also, what's so important is sometimes you have to take the abstract view of the territory in order to see, where the fire is coming from, or where there's a village when you go to build a new road. If you don't know about that village over there, you're going to construct your road to go right through it. So if you never take an abstract view, you can make a lot of mistakes. But we tend to, unfortunately, in society go, oh, that's abstract. So it's not practical, it's not concrete, it's not something we have to think about. And as a result, we make a lot of mistakes. We end up in a lot of trouble and we end up in a lot of problems. And so something that I find so important about the topic of the singularity is when we're describing the singularity, and you make some wonderful distinctions that I really appreciate between singularity, technological singularity, global brain singularity, all of these, which really help me get a grasp on the subject. I really appreciate that. But very often, I think people, say at least average people, can think about talk of this as being impractical or abstract as in not mattering, when in fact, they're living in it. They're part of the landscape that composes it. And the failure to think about it is going to result in us, say, building a road through someone's village. And now you have a war, you have a conflict, you don't see the fire coming, so you don't make the resources to adjust. And also, you don't see the landscape and understand it to develop your civilization in a way that is optimal, that is best, and perhaps the best of all possible civilizations that you could have only gotten because you took that big picture view, if you will. One of the things I love so much about your approach to this topic is that you're bringing in the human, you're bringing in the anthropological, you're bringing in the psyche, you're bringing in the person to the conversation of what does it mean to be an individual that is toward the singularity, that is heading that direction, that is part of a history moving toward greater and greater integration. And how do we prepare? How do we think about that? And just seeing that all together and how it really brings into focus also the extraordinary concreteness of what otherwise we just think of as abstract, and how this matters so much. And so the work that you've done on it and that you do on it is greatly appreciated. So when it comes, Dr. Last, when it comes to your paper, and also your general thesis as well is on this, which is marvelous. And your PhD presentation, I believe, is on your channel that I think everyone should see because it's such an important topic. What got you interested in this? What are some of the ideas that really grab you, that pulled you into it? And how should we respond to those ideas, which can come on later on, so that we can be properly prepared for what's coming?
All right, yeah, that's a great first distinction there between the abstract and the concrete. And I think people who are maybe being introduced to these ideas for the first time might have that relation to it as it's like almost the perspective of it's too far away, like you were giving from the airplane, looking at the farms from below. well, that's too abstract. On the other hand, while I was in my PhD thesis, I was like your child looking at the concrete too close, and I got very much into the abstractions of the singularity, and then, you know, coming back, either coming from that plane distance to a middle ground, or coming, as some people listening might be, or coming from the looking at the concrete very closely and coming back to where I am now, you realize the technological singularity or the global brain singularity, and I'll make those distinctions, but you realize those concepts are actually extremely concrete. And that's what really got me interested in that in the first place. So I'll say what got me interested in this idea was, first, my original intellectual impulse from the very first was a type of being perplexed about the human in the grandest scale of, in a cosmic scale of things. Being perplexed about the human, I thought we were extraordinarily strange. And to maybe the best example to give of the level of our strangeness was that I give it within a scientific framework. I was blown away that we would be able to predict the movement of galaxies billions of years into the future. Right? Like we know where Andromeda galaxy is going to be X, you know, roughly speaking, X number of millions, billions of years into the future. And likewise, the movement of all the you know, cosmic phenomena. But we can't predict tomorrow, you know, so like, just to give an example of the level of the strangeness, I'd put it in that sense. And I think that's fundamental for science too, because science is based around prediction. And even the dominant cognitive science models today are about predictive processing. Those are like, that's like the technical name for the dominant contemporary models is our capacity to predict, you know, but actually the human phenomenon is extremely unpredictable because we're extremely complex. And also the fact that we are self-aware is another important factor, because, you know, if you tell the sun, I can predict when you're going to rise tomorrow morning, you know, it's not going to disobey that sort of prediction. But if you tell a human being, I know when you're going to wake up every morning, well, that human can say, well, I'm just going to fuck with you and wake up at a different time, you know, because you predicted I would wake up at that time, you know. So just the fact that we are so complex and so self-aware, and that, you know, magnified by the fact that there's billions and billions of us that compose the system, and the fact that we're producing sort of culture and technology which even exceed ourselves. So we're producing things that exceed us and extend beyond us. You know, that just gives you insight into the level of strangeness of the human being. So in terms of how I organized my intellectual career around that perplexity, I first was interested in evolutionary anthropology and history. And on the side, I was interested in science fiction and sort of techno-futurist visions. And by the time I reached the doctorate level, I was able to somehow get into a program which was specifically organized around the idea of the global brain singularity. So I had basically 4 or 5 years where I could just dedicate time to writing about global brain singularity and sort of bringing my ideas together from evolutionary anthropology, and trying to merge them with these futurist visions, which were usually produced by technologists, engineers, physicists. How I wanted to integrate with this field was to bring the humanist so-called lens, you know, anthropological lens, psychological lens, to basically start asking questions about, okay, well, I buy the argument that basically, you know, 21st century is going to be producing technologies that vastly exceed the capacities of present day technology. But what does that mean for politics? What does that mean for love? What does that mean for, you know, my life, like I remember like the biggest impactful moment for me was reading Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near, where he basically has this idea called the law of accelerating returns, which is based on the idea of exponential progress of computation, based on very, very coherent and very convincing evidence and argumentation. And, I'm reading through the book, and he's basically saying, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, all of this is going to be vastly improved in the next few decades. And the landscape of technological possibility in 2030, 2040, 2050 is going to be basically, a science fiction writer's dream from the perspective of the present day reality. And then, I'm sitting there at about 19 or 20 years old, and I'm thinking, well, 2030, 2040, 2050, I'm going to be alive then probably, so that's going to be my reality. So how does that involve me? How should I be thinking about love, relationships, career, politics, economics, all be in this context, right? So that's what sort of motivated me and got me thinking about this idea.
That's so magnificent. It got me thinking, like if you read a William Gibbons Neuromancer, or obviously the science fiction like a Blade Runner or different things, it's always funny. Or the Jetsons, we can even go to the cartoon, they're just boom, they're in the future. The person is just in the future. There's no transition period. And actually the movies that tend to have transitions are ones where the robots kill us all. It's like a Terminator or a Matrix, right? Where you see the development, the humans all die, or everything goes to crap. Or you're just in the science fiction world and it's given. It's just kind of there. And I don't think, exactly to what you're saying, we've really thought about what it would mean to, as subjects, as humans, to sort of transition into that future. Because as technology develops so rapidly, it also, just as soon as you start to get comfortable with the way the world is and it's given, and you can stop feeling so existentially anxious, the rug's pulled out from under you and there's a new world. And then just as you get the rug is pulled out from under you and different things like that. And you see, for a very long time, if we're talking about like information technologies, generally you'd have like writing is invented, and then you'd have thousands of years, and then the book was invented, then you'd have hundreds of years, and then you would have, it would kind of shrink and get faster and faster. Well, when you had longer periods of time, there was more time for human beings to get comfortable with the technology, to get a new sense of given. They'd be destabilized, like with the printing press, you had the Protestant Revolution, Reformation. Then you had like the German revolutions, all the violence. A lot of people forget the violence that can erupt around these new information paradigms and different things like that. But if the technology is so spaced, there's enough time for people maybe to get back to a sense of givenness, to get enough of a stability that when the next big information technology shows up, then they're stable enough that they get shooken up, but it's not so bad that it overwhelms them. Well, you're coming to a phase where people are still shook up and they haven't even gotten some semblance of stability before they're shook up again, and they're shook up again, and they're shook up again. That is very, very difficult for the human to handle, for the mind to be able to come to terms with, because what it does is ultimately expose the ontological groundlessness of being. Like you get into your Žižek, your Gödel, and different things. And that gets into where, based on our absolute knowing conversation, you almost need a society of absolute knowers. Well, is that even possible? What does that look like? How do you even do that? That is a massive challenge that, since I do so much in creative writing, I do a lot in the arts world, I am very fascinated by the fact that most stories, because people tend to form relative to stories, and stories tend to be an expression of some degree of the subconscious, not necessarily entirely, but to some degree. And there's such a lack of stories that show this, this period of coming to terms with the increasing instability that will result from acceleration. Again, you either just skip to the future, where you're in the science fiction world and it's the new Gibbons, or the robots kill us all, or something like that. You very rarely have. I think the best, your movie review was wonderful, is like Her. I think that's a really good example of trying to show more coming to terms, but I find that rarer, a kind of rarer work. And I'm going to press you to do more movie reviews because I really like that. And then
Her is a good example of that. And that's a very powerful movie in regards to this losing ground and realizing, the ground's going to radically transcend you in some sense. But
oh yeah,
I think your description here of the rug being pulled out of a new world forming is a good place to like define for people listening what is the technological singularity.
Yes.
Technically is the so first, the concept of singularity is a much older concept from mathematics and physics involving infinities, basically, where either the mathematics points to an infinity or the very fabric of space-time points towards an infinity in physics. And then the technological singularity is derived from physicists and engineers and cyberneticians who are thinking in these ways, and they're perceiving or coming into contact with cybernetic technologies like artificial intelligence, and they're basically saying, okay, well, if this technology keeps advancing at the rate it's advancing, eventually it's going to reach a sort basically a prediction horizon where the computing capacity of this technology vastly exceeds all of the computational capacity in the human brain and all of human brains combined. And that means basically that from our perspective, it's basically like an infinite beyond. From our now they make it, it's not actually, and Kurzweil makes this very clear. Kurzweil says it's not actually an infinity, but it's an infinity. It might as well be an infinity from our perspective, because we can't make any sense of it at all. And basically it's like technology is progressing so fast, and technology is the causal agent in that change being so fast, that humans just can't make sense of reality anymore at all. And I think that that's interesting in the context of a lot of the intellectual spaces we're roughly adjacent to, because there's a way in which the dominant sort of ideas in these communities is a problem of sense making. And there's this idea in these sense making communities that we are going to be able to remake sense of things, but the idea in the technological singularity is actually much more radical, which is no, this is the end of you being able to make sense in a holistic way. It vastly exceeds your capacity as an individual cognition. Now, we can do collective sense making, but we'll never see the whole thing. Like, through collective sense, it's good that we do the sense making activities and collective sense making activities, but we're never going to regain the whole, so to speak, and like reground the world. The world is itself rapidly shifting and being I mean, I think that's why ultimately in my personal life, I just end up shaking myself, because we're being constantly shaken by the constantly. Right. So let's shake them. Let's shake. And let's get used to not knowing, and let's get used to unknown, and let's get used to groundlessness, basically. And that's I think what brings me to the contemporary work I'm doing with Žižek and Hegel, with the idea of absolute knowing precisely being this ground in groundlessness kind of thing.
Magnificent. And again, something I really appreciate about your work is how it's all in concert with one another. It is all speaking with one another. It is all part of, when you're talking about Freud is relevant for dealing with the technological singularity, this state
exactly.
where it's impossible.
I say there's been a through line. Like, to me, it's a my whole work is a continuity from basically that kid in college, like when I'm 18 or 19, being perplexed about what the hell are human beings, and like being, very, to me, it's just a continuity. It's a very singular drive related to this.
Well, in the same way that, like, if I'm in Rustburg, Virginia, it doesn't seem to have any relation with Lynchburg, Virginia. But then if I get in an airplane, I see a road connecting them, right? They're always connected. It depends on the point of view. But the issue is, when you're doing such a critical project, you have to go into build up Rustburg, Virginia, per se, make it seem like you're not thinking about Lynchburg, Virginia at all, but you have to make Rustburg to then make the road to get to Lynchburg, and Lynchburg to Charlottesville, Charlottesville to New York, and so on and so forth. So when you're dealing with, like, and the thing is, the technological singularity is also, as you get higher integration and what, as you mentioned, it also becomes increasingly impossible or implausible, dare I say, to not have an awareness of how these things connect and how they all influence one another. Like, what does Freud have to do with computers? A lot. It doesn't seem like it does when you're in, Russburg. It doesn't seem, if Russburg, and that's a small town nearby, when you're in Russburg, it doesn't seem like Freud, quote unquote, has anything to do with Lynchburg and computers. But as you approach the technological singularity, oh yeah, it has a lot to do with it. And it has a lot to do with economics, because that economics is tied to motivation and human motivations for doing things. And how do you convince them to go and drive the truck that's going to support the supply chain if they don't see any value in it, and they're, and they don't see value in it because they can't deal with their marriage. And that is all going to lead to an environment where economically you're falling apart. And if economics has a way of existentially stabilizing people. Life is hard, but at least if you're somewhat middle class, you can kind of go, okay, this sucks, but I at least am middle class. Man, if you're not middle class and you have the inability to do sense making because of the technological singularity, well, then people go crazy. And so it all, it becomes very difficult. So everything is connected in really profound ways. But the problem is very often when people will say things like that, it's, dare I say, cheap. Kind of all is one, where it's kind of vague. It's like all is one. No. Like, you got to go into every individual difference, do the work in the individual difference, and see how they particularly connect. You have to have a costly unity, if you will.
I've realized that because I've actually, through my doctorate work and stuff, I've had the pleasure and the opportunity of collaborating with a lot of people who call themselves interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, but oftentimes that's kind of just an empty word in some sense. It's a nice framing for an institution to sort of promote that idea, but not actually really much new or interesting work comes out of these initiatives because they're kind of cheap unities, like you're saying. I think that's worth saying. I think in order to really do interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work, you really, like you said, you have to really go into something really different. Like, you really have to go into something different that you have no idea what's going to happen to what you currently know, and then retroactively you'll maybe be able to make sense of what you were previously doing. And that's basically how I've operated. Is like, I was in anthropology, and then I went into something radically different, the technological singularity, and then I did that, and then I went into basically philosophy and psychoanalysis, which was something radically different from the technological singularity. And then all of these going into something radically different will help me retroactively make sense of the bodies of knowledge that I was previously engaged with. So the possibility to make connections between, for example, like Hegel and Freud and like Kurzweil and Darwin are like massive. The possibilities to make connections between those thinkers are huge. And I think that would be real, like, trans or interdisciplinary work.
Yeah, I mean, it brings to mind that Bonhoeffer. It's almost like the difference between, as we're taught, like cheap interdisciplinary and costly interdisciplinary. And so much of the interdisciplinary is cheap, where it's very surface. And you're not being interdisciplinary because in the same paper you mentioned literature, economics, and science. They have to actually have gone into them and found these essential connections. But problematically, it's almost like as you approach a technological singularity, there is a subconscious sense, if you will, that you need to be more interdisciplinary, but you actually don't want to do the work to do that, because as much of it was demanded, it would destabilize all your traditional academic institutions and different things. So you do it just enough to be able to plausibly convince yourself that you're taking it seriously, but not so much that it would destabilize the institutions and, dare I say, idols that you are attached to. And the human is very good at, the human is very good at playing those games of self-deception, which self-deception is always fascinating, because if you knew it was self-deception, it wouldn't work. So you have to find this kind of almost like cooking a pie. You have to find the right ingredients and the right mixtures of engagement but disengagement so that you can convince yourself you're fully engaged without doing it in a manner that would force you to face the quote unquote real. And we're very good at finding those spaces.
My mode for sort of working with that self-deception is you've got to kind of work against yourself. In some sense, like that's the only, like, that in some sense, in order to avoid self-deception, is that you've got to be willing to go against yourself. Like in like, to give a concrete example, like I would say, like, my first intellectual heroes were like Darwin and Dawkins. Like the nexus of Darwin and Dawkins, like the evolutionary worldview, basically, right? And then, you know, in some sense, you know, with Kurzweil and the singletarians, I mean, I was not going against it, but I mean, I was embedded in a universe that was other than that. And then when it comes to like figures like Freud and Hegel, I would go even further and say, like, in some senses, they are against, you know, Darwin and Dawkins, and they make meaningful reorganizations of that worldview in a way that you can no longer identify with it in the way that you once did. So that capacity to think against yourself, that capacity to, you know, to really question your underlying axioms. You know, it's like the difference between, you know, like I remember when I was in that Darwin-Dawkins view, I would spend a lot of time trying to undermine religious axioms and religious subjects, you know, their axioms, trying to pull the rug from out under their feet, so to speak. You know, but I think really what the mature, wiser stance is to try to pull the rug from out under your feet. You know, like, don't worry about other people will pull, you know, they'll figure out their own relationship to having the rug pulled out from under them, and that's all fine.
No, that's magnificent. You know, in the paper on critical thinking, you know, very often, you know, people will talk about critical thinking as just more advanced thinking. But I think a better way to think about critical thinking is almost like a movie critic watching a movie and analyzing the structure of the movie and how it all goes together and so forth and so on. Likewise, you're really a critical thinker if you are a critic of the way you structure thought to yourself and are aware that you are in the business more of making yourself feel comfortable than actually determining the real. And so critical thinking needs to be thought of as critiquing your thinking, but you also have to keep in mind that your thinking is in the business of convincing you that you're a critical thinker when you're not. So there's always going to be this act of checking yourself. And critically, I really am so glad you brought up what you were saying on sense making. That kind of critical thinking. So we're all concerned about like regaining sense making, right? And how to do sense making. My whole thing in like the conflict of mind is how it is going to be increasingly the case that so a conflict of mind, what I call a conflict of mind, is when epistemic possibility comes in conflict with epistemic responsibility. So what I mean by that is what is possible for you to know, you're going to feel like you need to know, but it's not possible for you to know because it so transcends human capacity. But the issue is, just because it transcends human capacity, you can still feel like you should try and that you should do your best. So for example, everyone's been facing, like, you got every time you turn on the news, right? It's coronavirus, Ukraine, inflation, all these big subjects. Where do you even begin? How do you get going? You feel like you need to know about these subjects. And indeed, you need to know something about these subjects, but there's a certain limit to where you can go. And yet at the same time, it doesn't seem to be the temptation is to just say, well, it doesn't involve me, it doesn't matter, right? Well, that's an extreme. But another extreme is to act as if you don't have some limit to your epistemic possibility that you can reach unless you're going to devote your entire life to that subject. But then if you devote your entire life to that subject, you're not devoting it to another subject, and so on and so forth. So there's always going to be conflict of mind situations. As we approach the technological singularity, the unavoidability of conflict of mind situations, the inability to ultimately achieve sense making will become undeniable, increasingly undeniable. And if people aren't ready for it and preparing for it, the response, the existential tension, the way society developed will probably be quite poor. It will probably not go very well. In the same way, if I know that there's a high probability that one day I'll have to be able to run a 10-mile, like let's say a marathon, or else I'm going to die for some reason, someone will shoot me or something, or I'll lose my family. You just come up with whatever example. It would be really silly for me not to start training now. It would be really silly for me not doing the work. But I could always, until that day, convince myself that it's not going to be so bad, that it's actually not going to happen. And then it happens. The likelihood of me pulling through is not very good. Similarly, if we are not training in, say, understanding absolute knowing as a state of knowing your limits, the Freudian ways of how the mind operates, the inescapability of conflict of mind situations, then the likelihood of the technological singularity not leading to a massive backlash against it becomes very, very low. And I think you see that now. Increased integration is just leading to strong reactions against that increased integration.
I think there's a lot that overlaps there. I think that there's huge I mean, what it seemed to me you're describing with this relationship between epistemic possibility and epistemic responsibility is like really like the zero level of the universal and the particular.
Yes.
Like in regards to, like when I say, like when I try to take increasingly seriously that the universal moves through the particular, I feel like the closer we get to technological singularity, the more that will become unavoidable.
Yes.
That actually this involves you fundamentally, and that this involves a type of this is what makes people philosophers. This is what forces everyone, almost in some sense, there's a pressure for everyone to become philosophers.
Like the revenge of philosophy. I think
that's the revenge of the revenge of
phrase.
philosophy is like you know, we've gone through an age of like the non-philosophy and like we can get rid of philosophy and stuff like that. But I think this forces almost everyone to become a philosopher in some sense. And you know, you do have those problems of, like you gave examples, coronavirus, Ukraine is like, you know, how do I make sense of this relationship between epistemic possibility and epistemic responsibility? Now, like to give a weird example of that is like, I remember when coronavirus broke out, I was actually at my home with my family, and my mom said, you know, you're a doctor, you know, shouldn't you be able to do something? You know, I was like, well, you know, like, but there's this idea like, well, you have the universal understanding, right? So you should be able to do something as a universal, but it's not quite like that. You know, like I'm actually quite a limited being. You know, like I can take you know, I responded saying like, yeah, I can't even really, I don't even really have power to control how this family operates, let alone the fact that coronavirus is like out of, you know, we're extremely limited, but knowing your limit is at the same time your participation with the absolute and so forth. But yeah, these conflict of mind situations, as you and I would say actually like to bring some synergy between what you've been working on and what I've been working on as regards to, like, you know, I'm focusing on this like Freud Hegel axis. I would say that Freud and Hegel are thinkers of conflict. You know, I think that they are, you know, they think through conflict. They don't try to pretend. And also as it regards to like my first intellectual hero, Darwin, I think that he was also a thinker of conflict in the world of biology. So I think this capacity to think conflict is important, and I think to bring it to the level of mind and to bring it to the level of epistemics is important.
Oh yeah, because you know, I like that from, you know, Mr. Clifford, where he would talk about if you knew that a boat had a hole in it and you let your friend use it, even if they got to the other end, they got to where they were going, you still were kind of unethical because you knew there was a hole in and you let them do it anyway. So he's trying to create a connection between ethics and knowledge. And I'm not sure if Mr. Clifford succeeds. I think William James takes it out, but I've always really liked generally the idea of epistemic responsibility. There's this kind of notion that I feel responsible to know about something, or responsible to act on knowledge, or to gain a knowledge so that I can act. But the issue becomes, there are things that it's not possible for us to know. And as we approach the singularity, that's going to become unavoidably, you know, we can kind of convince ourselves right now. It's kind of funny because the internet actually makes you feel like you can be up to date on everything. Because I can watch all the YouTube videos. I can be up to date with it. When really we're discovering now, like Mr. Stein does work on, there's so much propaganda, there's so much fake news. How do you tell the difference between the fake and the real, and the stuff you can trust, what you cannot? It becomes really, really difficult, and you may not have the tools by which to sort all of that. So, but you feel responsible to somehow try, but you don't know how to try. You don't even know how to go. You don't have a mechanism to sort what you should be concerned with, what you shouldn't be concerned with. So you get in this giant mess that feels like you don't have a ground because you don't. And that's what's becoming more undeniable. And then there's a strong existential response to it, anxiety, that unfortunately then makes people turn to totalitarianism, anarchy, and all these forces of totalizing, or like you talked about in your great piece on the temptation of conspiracy theories to bring everything together. And in the same way that I find it really interesting that most thought about the technological singularity is not the very way we think about the technological singularity in not bringing up the conflict of mind situations suggests how much we don't want to think about conflict of mind situations.
That would be a good place for you actually to engage. I would like if I was to give some sort of idea here in relationship to what I was working on in my thesis versus what you've been working on here is like, I actually think it would be worth reading Kurzweil through the perspective of the conflict of mind, because I think if Kurzweil could be critiqued of anything, it's that he doesn't take conflict of mind seriously enough. So that's to your point of we've made in private about this idea that a lot of, and that was really what also motivated me to write the thesis, was that a lot of the people who were talking about technological singularity actually weren't trained in psychology and anthropology and the human sciences. So I felt like that was a lack in their worldview. And so I feel like a lot of their predictions as it related to future technology were sort of valid and made a lot of sense, and things that we should take seriously. Like almost, I would say like we should take as seriously the predictions about the future possibilities of computation as we take the trajectories predicted by climatologists about the future of the weather, for example. Like they're sort of similar, but they're sort of similar prediction horizons in the sense and the way they're going about making those predictions. But same with the climatologists, like actually engaging with the psychosocial material as it relates to the climatological predictions is sorely lacking. So that's sort of like the way I viewed my engagement in the
that's fantastic. I have not done a paper that would do it. That's actually really interesting. I've been collecting, our dear friend Mr. Frege, so I'm going to advertise his book. I was collecting notes out of his ontological design. Everyone go buy it. Go buy it.
Go buy that shit.
I was getting notes out of that and Bard's and their digital libido and syntho but that would be interesting to just particularly focus on Kurzweil. Okay, I wrote a note here. I should do that.
It's
that's
worth reading. The Singularity is Near, by the way. Like that is not only is like it's a remarkable citation classic. It's got like it's huge. I mean, but the impact, the concrete impact that Kurzweil had on what's going on in contemporary Silicon Valley cannot be understated. He had and it's really interesting too, studying Kurzweil as a man in his career, because he obviously went on to try to work on language software at Google, and he became director of AI at Google. But like the thing is like Kurzweil's predictions and his books are built in like a feedback loop with his actual work in technology, because I mean, he writes the book on the singularity, and then he's head of Google creating the AI that he predicted would come about in 2029, right? So he's involved, like
kind of the absolute sort of thing, yeah.
So he's like 2029. By the way, I first came across Kurzweil because of an Our Lady Peace album. I don't know if you know Our Lady Peace, but they're a rock album. They're a rock band. And they had an album called Spiritual Machines, and they had Kurzweil clips as their interlude between songs, and Kurzweil would be talking about like the years.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a super cool album. I really liked it. I was like rocking to it hard. But Kurzweil's interlude would be like, it's the year 2029. The machines tell us they're human, and we believe them. And then it would cut out to a new track or something, and like it'd be like it's the year 2045, and he's basically putting in his predictions into this interlude of the album. But he's making predictions about, like, specifically the most famous predictions are, in 2029 we are going to have artificial intelligence that can speak with human language in a way that's indetectable between humans and AI. So there's going to be no more capacity to distinguish whether a human's talking to you or whether an AI is talking to you. Does that sound realistic still in 2022? Well, that might hold up. That might hold up. The predictions he's making are actually quite believable in some sense. Then he's saying in 2045 we are going to have computation that vastly exceeds the computation of every human brain on the planet. And then that's sort of like the marker for his technological singularity.
Well, the thing that you're talking about with the Turing test, and where you can't recognize the robot and the human anymore, like now people are going crazy because they don't know if their neighbors are liberal or conservative in America, right? They don't know if the people around them believe what they believe and who's the enemies, who's friends, who thinks the vaccine's good, who thinks it's bad, who thinks Ukraine is okay. Like there's like an insanity that's going on. Well, times that by 20 when you don't know who's a robot and who's not, but you know there are robots out there. You see, that's one of the things that I always find really interesting is very rarely in science fiction. Now, there's some, I'm generalizing. If you can't tell who is, say, an AI and who's not an AI, then everyone could be an AI. And that's the step that everyone kind of misses. Often in the discussion, it kind of makes me think of Žižek and the Wired Brain when he's talking about there's a difference between not having milk and not having cream, even though there's not a difference, but there is a difference, right? And there's because there's a thought of a difference. There is likewise a difference between a world where there's humans, a world where there's humans and AI, and a world where there's humans and AI that are not indistinguishable, precisely because it changes the possibility of the human. So you can't tell who's who anymore. That in of its own right is a force, that's a forceful confrontation of an epistemic limit. You can't know anymore, but you know that you can't know anymore. Now, if you've got training in absolute knowing, you know, if we use that as a phrase, then you're used to that. And you're okay with it, and you can existentially handle it. And actually, it opens you up to a new world. Wow, it's a cool world. We're in a place where there are different kinds of possibilities, different kinds of beings. Isn't that neat? But if you're not familiar with living with limit and finding limit exciting, it is utterly horrifying. You know, imagine people on their first date going, okay, John, I just got to know. Are you an AI or not? And that's like a big moment where they unveil it or anything like that. I'm going to tell a story about that. Like that's the kind of world you would have in, like where people would not know. And if you can't, if we're not going to train ourselves, and I think it's just very, you know, important to clarify, no one is saying like the technological singularity is necessarily bad or that it's going to be so on. More of the issue is that the likelihood of it being bad, if people aren't preparing for it as subjects to be in that situation, if you're not getting familiar with conflicts of mind, as I like to call them, then as conflicts of mind become more intense and more difficult to avoid, as will be the case if you get technological singularity, then people will politically, socially, and so on probably respond very badly. And that could have consequences, and who knows what those consequences will be. Probably following like a Berger or a Hunter, what will happen is people turn to totalitarianism or utter isolationism is what tends to happen in those circumstances.
Well, the few ideas, like one of the most salient criticisms Žižek has of Kurzweil's ideas is that like oftentimes the singletarians, they have this idea that technological singularity somehow equals we are going to be in a world of excessive bliss or excessive pleasure or excessive positivity. And he just makes the point that doesn't the technological singularity also simultaneously open up the possibility for extreme horror and pain on a level that we've never imagined before? I think both are open. Like, yes. I think and I think like we can already make parallels with technological progress and the 20th century, because like, did 20th century technological possibility open up exploration of pleasure and excess in a way that previous centuries hadn't enjoyed? Yes. Did the 20th century also open up levels of horror and pain that humans had never previously expressed? Yes. So I think both are opened up, and I think that that's really where philosophical thinking needs to come in. And
absolutely.
In regards to this idea of the capacity to think negation, you know, like Žižek uses that example of a, you know, you order a coffee and you get coffee, is it not with milk or not with cream? He's basically saying like there's a negation inherent to every positive object, that there's a meaningful negation inherent to every positive object. But while you were speaking, I actually thought of an example the Žižek gives that example all the time. But like, I actually thought of an example that might be better than his example, which is, imagine this. This is, to me, hits home more concretely. Is like, imagine you're dating a girl named Sally. Okay? You're boyfriend and girlfriend with a girl named Sally. I'm not going on a date with Sally, or I'm not going on a date with Mary. Right? Like Sally's all of a sudden, you're not going on a date with who? Like, who's Mary? Right? Like, right? Like,
right.
You know, like so that level of negation, maybe it hits home, but like
that's great.
Yeah. I think that this conflict of mind, thinking conflict of mind and technological singularity is an important one.
Well, and the thing is too, like if you exist in a world where, you know, you have, say, robots, if I just use that language, that you can't tell the difference between the human and the robot. Well, then when you're dating Sally, Sally is not robot. You know, even if they're not a robot, but you know they could be a robot and maybe be more, you know, then Sally will know that you know that she's not a robot. And what if you want a robot because they're more perfect and they're more customizable? And the tension that then will have to be negotiated, because the sexual space is always that space of radical negotiation. One of your videos that I really love, you made that point where you were saying, you know, generally, you know, as long as sex isn't involved or any sexual tension, thousands of people can coordinate pretty successfully, you know, based on the system of doing. But the moment sex gets involved, oh man, everything can kind of explode really, really quickly. Sex is really difficult because it's that intimate space. And also, of course, based on, you know, the what is sex, Zupančič and different things, sex tends to be the realization of the impossibility of, you know, whole, you know, primordial unity, oneness, and different things like that. And that's a traumatic realization. And people either respond to that traumatic realization by hating one another or coming to terms with it. And you have to come to terms with it. And instead of seeking, say, I like to say, instead of seeking that that primordial oneness, that wholeness, you know, instead you learn to get harmony, which is where you have difference, but the difference can create a music like in an orchestra that could never be created with just a single instrument. So you have to move your thinking from trying to find oneness to finding harmony, which appreciates deep difference and sees deep difference as making possible, quote unquote, music that couldn't arise otherwise. You know, Michelle will talk about, in light of Rilke, you know, Rilke will talk about honoring difference, protecting your difference, protecting your loneliness, you know, because that's the space where you can actually get a certain horizon that you otherwise could not get. But basically what will have to happen following like this, you know, this Turing test world, is people will have to come to terms with not being an AI, you know, not being a robot, in being human. And they will have to be able to see something positive about that negativity, dare I say. They will have to say that I'm human. You know, I think Žižek also talks about how it's precisely the process of imperfection that creates. You know, I think, you know, like language, the stumbling through, if you could get like a perfect language, you'd actually lose language because language is made in incompleteness. So likewise, we as humans have to actually think. We have to really come to the place where we understand that our inability to get total sense making is actually an asset per se. We have to see the conflict of mind as an asset. But people, that takes a lot of meditation and integration with lack. That takes a lot of time. And if we waste that time and we don't get ready for it, and then boom, here you go, but it's almost like too late at that point. You know, and it's like you're not prepared for it.
But I actually think I got an idea that was inspired from what you were saying, and also a meme I saw last night where, you know, as it relates to this, the realization of the impossibility of wholeness, oneness, as it relates to the sexual real, that this is a traumatic realization, and that what we have to come to terms with is basically a harmony that appreciates deep difference. Is that there was I think this is important for the future of the left. Is that as it relates to radical politics and communism, is that there's this meme that said, the top of the meme says, what people think left unity means. And it showed like union workers with like a sign that had one unified symbol of like the communist revolution or something like that. And then it said what unity on the left actually means. And it showed like a multiplicity of like sexually strange people. So like, you know, like boys who were exploring like being cat boys, and like e-girls who were doing like OnlyFans and stuff like that. Right. Like, so it was just basically showing like a weird sexual multiplicity or ecology. And like, that's unity, you know, like unity, that would be harmony with deep difference.
Oh yeah.
So like, I think that's, and I think that's where I think that's where we're ultimately heading with the technological singularity, is that it's opening up the human individual in terms of the raw contents of the unconscious in a way that historical civilization just was impossible.
No, I think that's magnificent. and I want to talk about how when you talk about the dialectical, approach to technological singularity, which I think is critical, because if you're not taking difference as deep, then when you get into the technological singularity and you're forced to confront the reality that difference is deep and it goes on to the sexual and the unconscious and different things, well, you're not ready. And then the response will be like Maoist China or something, and that's not good. It makes me think about, I think it's in The Death of Character with Dr. James Hunter and Peter Berger. I think Charles Taylor in The Secular Age kind of mentions this, but, a lot of them will talk about how when we talk about multiculturalism, the problem with multiculturalism is that we treat it as if it's just kind of like food, outfits, holidays, difference are these kind of surface things. And I could, of course, say, go to China and put on the outfits and be part of the festivals. And when you talk about multiculturalism that way, it makes it feel like culture is very interchangeable and it makes it feel very touristy.
Let me give you an example of, because I grew up in Canada and I think Canada considers itself a multicultural country, which tries to basically integrate everyone into. But let me give an example of like where this deep difference comes out, like in a real way, is like my mom was a educational assistant at a primary school, and one of the problems at the primary school was that newly arrived immigrants from India, the children from the newly arrived immigrants from India, they have a whole different culture of the way they pee. Like they don't use urinals or they don't use toilets in the same way. They wanted entirely different structures for peeing. But the point is that and the point with that example is that it difference cannot just be integrated into the frame that you have now.
That's right. Exactly.
The very frame might change, right? So like the very way you design washrooms might have to change. Or like, for example, like that would be the example of a deep difference, is that it's not just integratable within your current frame. It's like your entire identity will change because of this difference.
Well, and the thing is, what Hunter is trying to stress is exactly what you're saying, is that we want to believe that we can be multicultural and it simply be a matter of letting people wear whatever outfit they want. But you see, that actually is not, culture is much deeper than that, he wants to say. It goes into this very deep difference. And his warning that he's giving all the way back in like 92, 88, a long time ago, along with Peter Berger and people like Philip Reef and different ones, is that, because we don't want to face the reality of deep difference, we are going to treat difference shallowly and create a society where then difference comes together. And when we then find out that difference actually is deep, we're going to turn to totalitarianism because we're not going to like it. And it's going to overwhelm us. And we're like, wait a minute. No one told us that culture was deep. We thought it was touristy. Oh, now screw this. We don't like this. This makes me reflect on myself and confront the real. I don't want to do that. Also, it makes, when we're talking about like a technological singularity, if difference is deep, then we as subjects have to do work. We can't just have our technology do it for us, right? Because if difference was shallow, then theoretically it's believable that just achieving the best of all possible technologies, we'd all just unify to it because difference is not deep and that would take care of it. But once you start saying that difference is deep, the challenge of pluralism per se, and the challenge of great integration involves you. You as a subject have to do something. You as a subject have to come to terms with the fact that it is not possible for everyone to be composed of every possible deep difference. You're going to have to come to terms with the fact that you are not going to be able to integrate with every possible deep difference. And that's very traumatic because you kind of are led to think that you can, or you want to believe it, or there's something primordial, that sort of desire to wholeness. And when you face the possibility of pluralism having to be a harmony of deep difference, as opposed to a kind of merging of everyone into a singularity of wholeness, that's traumatic. That goes against what you've kind of been led to believe is possible. And the response to that will probably be very, very poor. And of course, the issue is that if we're seeing what's happening in 2022 world on a political level with difference, I mean, arguably so much of Putin's thinking on Dugin is a multipolar world, it's like a traumatic response to deep difference that then leads to violence and invasion and returning of regression and different things. And then you have Trump and the Brexit and all of these different things. You are seeing a people or a global society that is facing the trauma of deep difference and not ready to respond to it. And unfortunately, it could just get worse.
Well, that brings me to like one of the conclusions in the final section of the paper is like that actually like where I end up with it is actually the prediction that we are going to have more and more and more radical individuation and more radical differences as we approach singularity, the exact opposite of a type of wholeness where everyone's integrated into the same thing. So that could function on the level of the state, China, Russia, Britain, United States, Canada. That could function on the level of communities, subcultures, as I think like the level of subculture, the level of difference within subcultures and the way they express themselves, that could express itself on the level of embodied community and family. The way family organizes and the way communities are organized becomes way really different. And that also expresses itself on the level of particular individuals, how particular individuals, and so it manifests itself on all the levels, but like, when you think about historical culture, you see like, for example, like everyone uniformly believing the same thing, everyone uniformly, operating by the same codes. And I think what we're going to be seeing as we approach singularity is the opposite of that. I think we're going to have the emergence of more and more different types of code and more different types of expression.
Yeah, no, I come to the exact, in Belonging Again, it's this movement toward away from givens into radical release, where you're going to have increasing difference and deep difference and coming to terms with it. And that's why you have a meaning crisis, if we use that language from Vervaeke. But then I also, as you know, I think we need to understand that we do have solutions to the meaning crisis, xenophobia, totalitarianism, nationalism, the things that Dugin talks about, but that we are holding ourselves to a higher standard, that we're not going to do that anymore. But that means we have to, if you hold yourself to a higher moral standard, you simultaneously also have to enter into a higher intellectual standard, like absolute knowing, Freud, Hegel, all these different things. Like, it's not going to do us any good. It's almost like you're like, we know racism is bad. We know that these hard divisions and things and violence and colonial, we know these are bad. So we know we shouldn't do them, or at least generally. Obviously, lots of people are doing them all around the world, but generally, we know we shouldn't do them. But what we also don't always appreciate is when you have a moral evolution, to maintain that moral evolution or advancement, whatever language you want to use, you also have to have an intellectual evolution to maintain it. And the intellectual evolution that needs to be maintained or happen is one more like absolute knowing, integrating with lack, accepting deep difference. Those are the things that have to happen for the meaning crisis to be a negative space that sublimates into something better, as opposed to just lead to an effacement. And I think that is where you want to go and kind of attack, dare I say, and deconstruct, in a positive way of Derrida, myths of a technological singularity being a wholeness, myths of the possibility of marriage being a return to a primordial movement, myths of all these different notions of oneness, with an emphasis on lack, precisely because that's going to increase the probability that you motivate an intellectual advancement that can maintain the moral evolution from previous ways of dealing with the meaning crisis and solving it, so that you can sublimate into something more. And tragically, it does not seem as if there's a great awareness of that. And kind of people need to enter into the space where they realize that. And I guess I would just say, to point to what I see as a kind of a larger arc of your work, I really appreciate how your work is all together in that. In going into Freud and going into Hegel and going into the technological singularity and the global and all these different things, how it's all part of actually a simultaneous a spread, and trying to maintain, in trying to rise ourselves to a higher and different kind of intellectual way of thinking to maintain the moral advancement, so that we don't actually lose the moral advancement and just regress into previous totalitarianism, anarchism, isolationism.
Yeah, and I guess that's why, in some sense, a lot of my work right now does focus on sexual difference, because that's an example of accepting the difference to maintain a higher moral evolution. Like, if you think about like a lot of the rights revolutions over the last 2 centuries, a lot of it has involved sort of bringing the feminine into the public.
Right.
And I think, at least for myself, I would like to maintain that moral evolution. But in order to like you're saying, in order to maintain that moral evolution, there needs to be an intellectual evolution that involves integrating lack. That's the way That's and then that involves overcoming a lot of myths, and that I think that could also be applied to different cultures and races as well. To be honest, I think that there's an accepting of the difference that needs to be achieved in order to maintain a certain level of the moral evolution that we've achieved in the past 2 centuries. And that work is also being forced onto us by the fact that we are a lot closer to one another as a human family than ever before. We are exposed to all human difference. So that forces itself upon us in this new technological environment anyway.
Well, let me ask you in regard to your paper, because exactly right. I love how your paper will talk about, you have like the cosmic evolution that you'll discuss in the paper in your work, and you bring that together with technological
cosmic evolution leads to cosmetic evolution.
That was a Freudian slip. Oh, that's really funny.
That is a Freudian. That is
hilarious. Oh my gosh, I just wrote that down. I want to do like a poem now.
From cosmos to cosmetic.
Wow. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. Well, and so like these things go together. I see in your work kind of thinking these things through and how they go together. And also, if I were to ask, how do you feel if I came up to you and I said, okay, so why did you feel like you needed to do that in your paper, in your work? And how is your approach to the technological singularity, say, maybe different than what you see other people dealing with the technological singularity? Maybe it has to do with taking difference seriously, obviously bringing in the psychoanalytical into the conversation. Those are some different things. But how would be some ways you respond to that as a more open question?
Yeah, so that might give me an opportunity to give like a quick overview on the logic of the paper, which is, so like, it's kind of my attempt to almost recapitulate the entire journey of writing the thesis itself. It's the final chapter in the thesis itself, and I'm kind of trying to do almost like what I was describing to you before in regards to like the trans or the interdisciplinary work as involving engaging a deep difference, which changes what you previously thought. So like I was almost going in, okay, like what is the technological singularity and so forth. Like it's basically, it's an interesting paradox that it involves, like we often have like this debate between reductionist science versus holistic science. I don't really get into that so much, as what I do is I take reductionist science seriously, and I try to understand reductionist science from a holistic perspective, meaning that reductionist science leads to historical consequences that have to be understood in the whole.
It's really good.
Does that make sense? Like that's my perspective on it. Like,
I love it.
So it's like, no, I'm not deconstructing reductionist science. I'm saying that reductionist science is a force within the whole.
Yes.
And so we have to understand reductionist science as a historical force. So like, for example, like in regards to like the ridiculous simplistic distinctions that are often made in postmodernism by saying like science is just another language game. It's like, actually, no, like artificial intelligence leads to universal consequences that Africans and Native Americans and Indians are all going to have to confront just as much as everyone else. Like it's a universal, like artificial intelligence leads to universal consequences for all human beings.
Yes.
Genetic engineering leads to universal consequences for all human beings. Robotics leads to universal consequences for all human beings, and so forth. So it's just a matter of sort of thinking about what are the possible scenarios as it relates to the relation between humans and these new technologies. So I go through what these scenarios are. They're a combination of, one extreme is sort of like we are a bridge to a technological form of life. That's one possibility. We don't know. Another is that these technologies lead to a deep symbiosis with human beings. So like we enter into like a more symbiotic relationship where there's like biology and technology that are sort of coexisting. And then there's a sort of a mix between the two where like you're going to have like some biotechnological mergers. You're going to have some technological life as like a different ecology, which maybe produces its own ecology, right? Like, so it could be a merger between the two as well. So I go into those, like that's basically the picture I'm painting. Then as it relates to the cosmic evolutionary philosophy, this informs this event. Because if you look at like, so cosmic evolutionary philosophy is like different than, for example, like a classical Newtonian picture of the universe. Because in a classical Newtonian picture of the universe, you have like absolute space and time, and like the universe doesn't begin and the universe doesn't end and the universe doesn't really change. So in a cosmic evolutionary philosophy, it's the opposite of that. So it's like a dialectics of like cosmic picture, because the universe is born, the universe is going to die, the universe grows, the universe might reproduce. We don't know, right? Like, but it might go through a life cycle. We don't know that, how far that metaphor goes. We don't know. But basically what the universe is a constantly changing, complexifying phenomenon that has produced new levels of qualitative material. So like, for example, physics leads to, we go through the narrative, physics leads to chemistry, leads to biology, leads to, culture, leads to technology. And this picture of the universe basically points to, okay, well, if what humans are basically, and this is where I get into like anthropological theory, like anthropological theory basically posits that we are biocultural entities, not simply biological entities. And so there's a feedback. And so like, if you zero in on that difference, that we are biocultural entities, well, there's actually an evolutionary tension, to think conflict of mind. There's an evolutionary tension between our biology and our culture. And that's reflected in our religions. That's reflected in our state ideologies, that like there's a reason why we go to the washroom behind closed doors. There's a reason why we have sex behind closed doors, because there's an actual tension between our biology and our culture. We don't want to see that, right? Like, so that this biocultural horizon actually points beyond itself. So like, if you zero in on the biocultural, it points beyond itself. So like, it points beyond itself in religion, obviously. It points beyond itself to some supernatural space. But it also points beyond itself if you get rid of religion, because you have political visions that point towards a utopia. It also points beyond itself among individual subcultures, where you have, for example, science fiction and fantasy, right? That points beyond itself to aliens. Like, if you look at science fiction in terms of connecting to the practical world, you have images of humans being contacted by aliens. You have stories of humans and technological life, like artificial intelligence and robotics. So you have this tendency of the biocultural to point beyond itself. Now, if you look at cosmic evolutionary philosophy as a whole, we know where the physics ends. It ends in what's called a heat death. That means that if the Big Bang is the maximal heat, well, then the end of the universe is the lowest heat. It's the lowest order. So it starts in the highest order and ends in the lowest order. But we don't yet know what the relationship is between the biocultural and the physical. We don't yet know why the universe has produced biocultural entities. Now, on the largest scale of the cosmos, we have ample evidence to believe that the universe produces biocultural entities, or may produce biocultural entities. Namely, we are a feature of the universe. We are not an accident of the universe. That it's a type of necessity of the universe, you could even say. One of the reasons for that is that the physics of the cosmos, of the entire observable universe, is uniform. The chemistry of the cosmos is uniform. We don't have evidence of biology being uniform, but since the physics and the chemistry are uniform, it's possible that the biology is uniform. It's possible that the culture is uniform. So that's a deep speculative hypothesis, but we can zero back in on the mystery of the biocultural. The reason why the biocultural is a mystery on the level of the cosmic evolutionary philosophy is because in science, you need more than one example before you can develop a theory. So like, we can develop a theory of the universe at large, general relativity, because we can observe many galaxies. We can observe many solar systems. We have many examples on which to build a theory. We can't yet develop a theory of life at large because we only have one example, Earth. We don't have a theory of life at large yet, because we don't have like, if we had 50 Earths, like 50 life-giving planets, well, then we could develop a theory about life that was more cosmic in its scope, because we have 50 examples. Like, we don't have, if we had contact with 25 technological civilizations, well, we could develop a theory of technological civilization, but we have one example.
Interesting.
And the one example we have is very strange when thought about from the perspective of the cosmos.
Right.
Because thought about from the perspective of the cosmos, what we like if you take Kurzweil's prediction seriously, you've got like a 2-century window where you go from being like horse and buggy to being like superhuman, super technological life forms. Like you have like a 2-century window where that's possible. It's like, well, that's very strange, because on cosmic scales, we're talking about billions and billions and billions and billions of years of time in order for anything meaningful to happen. Like the Andromeda galaxy and the Milky Way galaxy are going to merge into each other, but that's a process that's going to take hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. So like we're talking about time scales that are just absurd from the perspective of cosmos at large. So that brings us to the now the insanity of what we've been talking about the technological singularity, and so my basic, like, so that's what I was working with, and then this was my intervention. My intervention is basically, we need to understand this picture from the inside of the human subject. And that's extraordinarily difficult to do. So that's, I think, where like not only where like my writing gets extremely dense and complex, but it's also sort of where I feel like I'm waiting, like I'm almost like I'm trying to think it, but like I'm drowning simultaneously. Like, and that's been like, and that's like been the last few years of my life is basically in this space where I know there's something huge, but I struggle to fully think it and to communicate it. So my approach has been basically that we need to model the human mind and human social communities based on this idea of the not one. So the reasoning for that is that the singularity represents an infinite one. Singularities represent like an infinite one almost. I think that's fair to say. The idea that we model the human mind and human society based on the not one is how we would approach that singularity. Because by definition, if we're not yet in the singularity, then we're not in the infinite one. So it means that what we're constituted by is its absence.
Yes.
And that brings to the lack. So then I go into how we might model this not one, that we're not one. You can do that on the individual level. You can do that on the social level. And I actually go into the idea that you could model advanced science on the idea of the not one. So like I have an example in the paper where you could actually model theoretical physics communities based on the not one. So like I give an overview of all the physics communities and like how they're all competing to come up with the one theory of everything. Right. So and so like that would be an example of how the not one forms our epistemic spaces. And then finally how I sort of end the paper is that you can almost do like a historicization of the not one, meaning different forms of self-consciousness, hypothesizing their relationship to the not one differently based on sort of the history of the human society itself. So like, for example, I go through ancient, modern, and deconstructive metaphysics. So like ancient metaphysics had the view of the one as God or a transcendent superspace, and that gave power to theological transcendental structures. The modern world had the idea of the one as nature or physical laws, and that gave power to scientific and naturalist subjects. And then you have deconstructionist metaphysics, which basically sees the one as secular power, and that gave sort of legitimacy to social system totalization. And like, then we can go through like the history of these ones, which are really not one. And then that brings us to the idea we were talking about before of this like radical individuation, because in the real, it's actually not one. So that any one you come up with, like whether that's transcendental, natural, or social, it's actually not one. So no matter where you go. So what's left is kind of this radical individuation in relationship to this complexifying technological field. And then I have like a crazy idea, which I think maybe I should explain later or give some space to, because I think that's a lot anyway to go into.
I love that. That was so great. Cadell, I adored that. So we have this tendency where we don't think of reductionism as a historic moment. We tend to think of it as the truth. You know, reductionism is sort of and in the same way, when we talk about absolute knowing, there's a way in which we can go, okay, there's a bookcase right here. How is that for consciousness? Where I can say, okay, well, I'm able to see color, I'm able to see shape, and I'm able to kind of posit possibilities about the nature of the subject by how the bookcase is for me, right? And it's like kind of like not a mirror, but it's kind of like a phenomenon that I can kind of study, right? In the same way that there's a way is, how is reductionism for this kind of universal movement, as opposed to just isolating the universal moment into this reductionism? What ends up happening is, because we have a natural tendency to get isolated in our thinking by our historic moment, we then tend to interpret the movement of the universe reductionistly, which could say reduce into heat death per se. And so we just assume that that's how it's going to be. Simultaneously, we carry with us reductionist views of technological singularity, which, you know, only has like singular possibilities, wholeness, bringing everything together, which is actually reductionist because you're reducing difference into sameness per se, or you're treating difference as not deep. You're treating it as something you can overcome. So there's reductionist things going on. But we're actually making an assumption from that positioning of reductionism that is saying that biocultural development in the universe is not somehow changing the directionality of the universe, possibly toward heat death, that there might be an arising, that it might be more contingent than we realize, that we don't tend to realize because we're so reductionist, because we're captured by our historic moment. As a result, we can downplay the contingency of biocultural development, precisely also because in reductionistic thinking, we tend to only treat as most truth that of which you can simulate as a scientific experiment, which of course is impossible though, because you don't have 50 Earths and you don't see what happens on a greater complex scale in the sort of emergence of biocultural possibilities. And so we don't even think that. Please.
I just want to say that that's sort of where I started to diverge from the typical global brain theorists, is because what they thought as true was basically computer simulations.
Right.
They would try to come up with computer simulations of human society and then build a theory off of that. But I was just like, well, that's not that. I mean, that's getting more away from the true and the real as opposed to closer to the true and the real. I mean, it may maybe have, but just this idea that it's like people who say they're thinking holistically, but actually they're still,
that's exactly right,
trapped by the historical moment.
Well, in the funny thought, and now this is, you know, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm anthropomorphizing the universe. I don't want to make it sound that way. But in the same way that you don't get absolute knowing until you accept your limit, right? That there's an integration of limits, and that actually becomes, you experience the subject as an immanence, as a limitless, precisely because you're limited and you're inexperienced to get your limit. And so you have that double action occurring with the famous inversion of Kant's noumenon. It brings to the attention of, is there something about the very, if we just use this phrase heat death, and I know you talk about the age of black holes and different things, but, you know, is there something where actually the heat death of the universe is precisely the, dare I say, limit that then actually results in a universe having the development of biocultural development that could change the contingency of the universe, that the heat death has to play a necessary role for the emergent arising of that biocultural development. You see, because then we only see kind of the limit or the heat death as a sort of inevitability, doom. So why don't we just, it's almost like, so let's just have one giant technological singularity orgy before we all burn out, you know, let's have a party before the end of the universe sort of thing. Right. Because the singularity gets kind of tied up with a sexual sort of language in some respects. So that's where we tend to go, where we're not thinking instead about the very heat death being sort of how the universe then becomes for biocultural. And I'm trying to think of a way to think this, but we don't even think that because we don't think of limit as integrating with limit and lack as opening up new horizons, right? So we can't possibly think about biocultural development in the universe, which of course then with another 1,000 years, 2,000 years, who knows, and maybe technology has to play a role to have a new emergent result between the technology and the biocultural that then creates something else, and on and on and on, and who knows. We don't even think those thoughts because we're stuck in that reductionist paradigm, and we see it as the universal as opposed to a historic moment. And so that then, I think why this thought gets so big is because then everything I just said is itself an idea that the subject now thinks that then changes how they can behave toward the singularity, that can then change the horizons of the singularity, that then it's like we talked about with the absolute knowing, where the absolute is this, everything that is the case plus you, therefore you changing what constitutes the case, which changes you back and forth and so on and so forth. So then that changes the horizon of universal possibilities in an active way that just when you finish thinking about it now, it changes again. And so it always has to be moving, always has to be going ahead. But then we're trying to think that with a brain that doesn't like doing that likes to just have things solid. So it's very hard to think. It also brings to mind what Mr. Layman Pascal said about, I love what he said in the Religion and Lack talk, where he's like, you have to have a perfect universe. God makes a perfect universe and entropy destroys it, where when he made it imperfect, there was space for the possibility of regeneration. Where if it wasn't perfect, there's no possibility of regeneration. Imperfection makes the possibility of regeneration. So there's the thought too, where the very situation of the universe possibly going into heat death is precisely what makes possible a response of the universe into biochemistry that can perhaps open up possibilities on higher levels of emergence that could possibly change that outcome at some point or to some extreme in ways that are unknown. And it makes me think of that. And it also makes me think about if the biocultural is a necessary development of the universe for the appearance of the not one, as opposed to the one. Certainly the idea of the not one and then responding to that not one, which then in a kind of funny wordplay way, in order for the universe or being or whatever we want to say to avoid ultimate effacement, there needs to be a not one, then that thing that's going to be effaced, so that you can get something that's not being effaced and that can continue. So there's the kind of, those are all things you're not going to think though, unless you escape some of the more absolutist ways of thought.
There's a lot, this opens up a really interesting thread, which appears throughout my thesis and actually motivated me strongly. I think it's like my ultimate response to like what I see is like, let's say the horizon of figures like Bertrand Russell or Norbert Wiener. So like Bertrand Russell on like the logical positivism side and like Norbert Wiener on the cybernetic side. Like both of them basically find themselves at the end of their career kind of like accepting heat death. And like they basically sort of say like, that's our fate, like the best we can do is go down with the ship. And that's sort of like that's like the fate of the cosmos type of thing. And I guess like how I relate to that in a Hegelian sense is that they were capable of thinking substance but not subject. So like they could think the fate of substance, but they forgot, oh, there's a subject that's actually reflecting on that and could possibly change that outcome. And I would say that like that is actually the motivation at the heart of most, let's say, speculative singletarians. Right. Like most speculative singletarians have this idea that the force which counteracts the heat death is somehow related to the technological singularity. That there's a force related to the technological singularity which is involved in some sort of ordering procedure or some sort of higher order phenomenon which retroactively changes what we think about the history of the universe and the possibility of the universe. So I think that's important to emphasize. Now, I also engage in that sort of line of thinking. My way of engaging with that line of thinking actually brings me to the end of the paper, which I wanted to save anyway, so that sets it up nicely. Which is that ultimately what I try to do is, okay, if you it's basically a theory of maths and physics. So like the idea is like the Big Bang is the origin of physics. The Big Bang is the origin of physics, and that's the origin of the sort of the cosmic evolutionary philosophy. Now, physics on its own by itself tends towards heat death, but physics also produces emergent layers, like the biochemical and the biocultural. And on the level of the biocultural, you have the phenomenon of mathematical modeling. Or on the level of the biocultural, you have the idea of ideal logic. Now, this ideal logic and mathematics has a tension with physics. As if you ask any physicist and any mathematician, there's a tension between physics and mathematics itself. Because mathematicians often get pissed off at physicists because they privilege mathematics, which will explain physics, but which will discount the possibility that mathematics has its own ideality, namely that mathematics can create its own sort of physical structures and or create its own internal logic that has no relation to physics. So the idea here is that there's some sort of relationship between the two, which has yet to be resolved. And I think this is also where we get into a lot of tension with Plato and the history of the whole of philosophy.
Right.
The idea I have is that it's not what most singletarians think, and this is a distinction I make with other singletarians. So it's not that the universe is a computer. That's a common metaphor today. Like Newton had the idea that the universe is a clockwork, right? I actually think of the universe more organismically, as I gave the example before with the birth, death, and stuff like that. But actually, it's not that the universe is a computer, but it's that the universe is something which produces within itself, the possibility for creating new universes. And that is through possibly quantum computation.
Yep.
So the meaning for me of quantum computation, and ultimately I think quantum computation is kind of like the golden technology of this whole technological singularity conversation, is that what's imminent in the technological singularity, in this increasing individuation, in this increasing confrontation with the different subjects and difference, is the possibility that each subject potentially, I mean, this is an idea that like really pushes me to the limit, right? Like, but it's basically each subject is going to be entering into a technological possibility space where they can radically create their own universe.
Yeah.
And that's where new universe, and that maybe that's where universes come from. Like maybe universes come from an individuated process of historical spirit in the biocultural level, which actually basically you can program what substance is. You can program, that's the idea. So like that basically brings that like if you push that idea even further, then you have the idea that, well, what the Big Bang was sort of like the creation of a previous technological super civilization or something like that. This is all speculative.
Of course.
This is all and well, that's why I have such a similarity. That's why I have such a gravitation and an affinity towards Hegel, because Hegel has many passages in the chapter on absolute knowing where he says speculative knowing is basically God playing with himself.
Oh yeah.
So I do think speculative knowledge and fiction, and like that brings me back to brings maybe back to your work with fiction, but also like sort of my genesis with this path with fantasy is, I do think that what's great about the scientific technologists and the singletarians is that they give themselves a wider space of possibility to play with speculation, and to really play with speculation. So I think that that's why it's such an attractive area to do research and such an attractive thinking horizon, because I could not have thought all of this stuff if I just stayed within like anthropology, or if I just stayed within one discipline, or if I just stay, it required me opening myself up to kind of like playing with many different fields, but also sort of playing with all of those different fields along one drive, which was basically being perplexed about what the hell humans are. So that brings us, I think, full circle to everything.
That is magnificent. What you were saying, a few things. So, you're exactly right. People today will think of the universe as a computer. They'll think of it as a clock or whatever and so forth. The universe is a place where you can think of it as a computer, where you can think of it as a clock. It is a place that creates a speculative space. Basically, there's a part in a novel we did called Turn the World where this girl is trying to find the key to open the shed. and she's going through this key ring, and she describes each key as a different metaphor. And she describes each metaphor as trying to understand her life situation. She's like, no, it's not really a garden. No, it's not really a computer. And she's going through, looking through the right key. And which key opens which door is relative to the situation in the quote unquote historic moment. Maybe there's something about a temporary historic moment where the emphasis needs to be on thinking of the universe as a computer so that you can get to the next historic moment, but then you have to advance and change it, right? There can be a necessity, but also a necessity of progress, of going to the next key and different things like that. But the problem that also happens, like, so put your example, you're making the example of the possibility of quantum computing arising to new universes, for example. Well, if you're stuck in a way of thinking where singularity is the answer, not harmony or deep difference, well, then as quantum computing develops and maybe it unveils to you the possibility of making new universes, you're going to say, well, that's wrong. That's not supposed to be done. And you won't use it. You'll instead try to use the quantum computing in favor of a singularity that does not take difference seriously, which will then lead to pathologies and all the different problems that we talked about. Speculative thinking is kind of like the canvas on which a painting is made. It matters very, very much because what you speculate impacts what you practice today. Your speculative horizons will also impact what possibilities technology unveils to you that you think are worth pursuing, that you think have some validity to them. And so if you have a society because of a reductionist paradigm that doesn't think speculatively, it's going to be very difficult for us to make it very long as specters because we're not going to really own what we look at, and we're probably going to end up effaced. And, another way to put this, because there's this guy named Saint Anselm, and he wrote this, famous ontological proof and all this different stuff. To put it very generally, there's that idea that, God is the best of all possible beings. A being that is real is better than a possible being that is not real. Therefore, God is real. Now, of course, we don't need to sit here and go through the problems of that argument. But the main thing is that Anselm starts the prosologia saying that you're only thinking about God from your needs. That he's saying that and basically what he's telling you is that all thought is conditioned. That there is a precondition that has to be met for you to really think something. Another way to frame this is to say that if you're not thinking of a God that's real, you're not thinking about God. If you're not thinking about a God that's real, you're not thinking about God. And you're like, what? And it's like, well, wait, hold on. What does that mean? Well, the idea is that when you think about God, if you're a Christian monk or whatever, you're going to be like overwhelmed, faulty, and it's going to change how you think about it. Like the very mode that you think about something suggests if you're really thinking about it or not. Now, also, actually, what I think Anselm opens up is he shows that, if you're not thinking about a God that's real, you're not thinking about God. That would show that actually the only way that you would show God is not real would have to be an experience, right? Like you don't experience a God. Just because you can't think of a disproof to God would not mean that necessarily proves God, because in experience, there may not be a God, right? Well, guess what that does? That opens up the difference between the true and the rational. That shows a divide between what the mind can do and what the world is, right? Well, that means all rationality is conditioned by what you believe is true, right? Like if you think it is, I say it 1,000 times, if you think it's going to rain today, it's rational to bring an umbrella, even if it doesn't rain, right? If you have a society that is unwilling to engage in speculative thought, it has no way to think truths other than what is given to it, and it will consequently create a rationality relative to those given truths, but that will then necessarily destine it to a certain outcome that could be effacing. That could be very problematic. So the loss of the ability to speculatively think, that I think you're correct to suggest that the university, the academy kind of doesn't allow as much, or it gets kind of reserved over here, actually results in us not owning the truths that we pick that structure our rationality, and instead we simply absorb them from the world. And this gets into Mr. Frege's book, because then we don't engage in our own ontological design. We are designed, as opposed to doing designing. And so then, the technological, so then quantum computing can't do what you're describing. There's no possibility of it. All we can possibly do is end up in a effacing technological singularity, as opposed to one that could lead to like a technological harmony, because we don't think the possibility. And so, and then not only do we not think the possibility because we don't engage in speculative thought, we sure as heck don't prepare ourselves for it. We don't become absolute knowers or try to become absolute knowers. Arguably, no one can do it perfectly. We don't try to take seriously Freud. We don't try to take seriously our own role as a subject and forming the world around. We don't do any of that because we don't allow ourselves to speculate the thought of which would call us to do that. And so we don't. And so when the future shows up, it designs us instead of us design it. And the consequences can be effacement.
And I think this is one of this is to me ultimately what I'm trying to conclude with this paper, in this context, is it's an extreme, it's almost like the most empowering notion that you could ever imagine, because let me just give this quote from David Deutsch, who's a quantum physicist who specializes in quantum computing. He says, the possibility of quantum computation is that observers inside the universe can make an object with their knowledge structures that can simulate any physical process, end quote. So the idea that what's awaiting us potentially if we handle the conflicts of mind as a process is that we live inside of a universe where our knowledge structures will be able to simulate physical process. That's actually quite an enormously empowering notion. And it differentiates us from the academic structures in a scientific way, where we focus on givens, like you study biology, you study chemistry, you study physics, versus the contemporary philosophies of deconstruction, where you try to tear down and pull apart. Is actually, no, it's a combination of speculation and design. If you're a great speculative thinker and you want to create something from that speculation, I mean, this is a loop where ultimately it opens up a new type of humanity and a new relationship to reality. And I think that's ultimately what I'm trying to point towards. So I do think there is a connection between the work Daniel Frege is doing, ontological design. I mean, I think that connection, I actually tried to make that connection when we did an ontological design session at the Stoa, that ultimately what we're getting into is a big phase transition where what a science, including subjectivity, points towards is actually designing ontology in some sense. Is that it's, instead of the question the example in a question I give at the end of the paper is basically, early science asked itself the question, what are the physical laws of the universe? Postmodern science asks itself the question, why are these the physical laws? Right? So that's a huge phase shift. And physicists themselves don't really even realize that they're postmodern. But that's a huge difference. So in classical science, what are the physical laws of the universe? You get sort of standard physics. Why are these laws the laws of the universe? You get this idea of a multiverse where there are many different consistent universes. Right. There are possibilities, given the mathematics, given the mathematical framework, there could be billions upon billions of different universes with different laws and different, tweaked to different levels and stuff, and maybe even different laws altogether. So why those laws? And then with this view, which I think is a more, I say it's a transcendent modernism, but it's basically it's a combination of speculation and design. It's getting into the place where we're actually going to be creating the technologies which retroactively allow us to design possibility spaces of cosmos. So that's a really different view of the universe. And so ultimately that does, I think this work, this wasn't my goal, but this is, I think, the consequences of it is this really does open up a different way of thinking about philosophy and subjectivity and society, fundamentally. And it's just and I see I don't know, that's, I who knows what's going to happen with all this stuff.
No, I think you're on the cutting edge of the most important questions. Because so a few things. One of the things that really hurts us is we do not appreciate the role of speculative thought in decisiveness, in the ability to live with something, in the ability to accept something, because speculative thought is just speculative. At the beginning, I was saying we tend to other things we call abstract. We say that is abstract, therefore it does not matter, is basically what we do. We other it. We do a very similar thing when we say that speculative thought, we other it. But the truth of the matter is that people who don't engage in speculative thought, this would be an entirely different conversation. They really struggle. They can struggle with, if someone doesn't tell them what to do, they don't know what to do, because they are not able to imagine the possibilities that they can do. And then they're also, here's the other thing. Not only do you have to have the ability to imagine possibility, you have to be comfortable with committing to one of them and bearing the weight of knowing you didn't commit to the others and living with that and being okay with that. That's why I kind of end Reconstructing A talking about the real choice, choosing something and really choosing it, which goes completely against our attitude today. We don't want to really choose anything at all because it limits you, and we don't want to be limited. But of course, if you don't have any limits, Bard was mentioning that on the tribal singularity. If you don't have any limits, you don't have any creativity, and there's going to be all sorts of problems that happen. And also today, people talk about how nothing feels real anymore. Well, yeah, nothing feels real until you make a real choice, until you're stuck in something. I always love, I've mentioned this before, but there's a really great book, Blackness Visible, Charles W. Mills, who passed recently, which really sucks because he was really smart. But he had this part in one of where he was saying, he's like, if you're a slave and you're getting beat up by your master, you don't ask if other minds exist. Other minds exist. And he also made the point where if your life is defined by oppression, that the world is real. You don't ask questions of how do we know there's reality out there? Kind of how do we know? It is. Now, that's not a technical proof, but it practically functions as a proof. You don't question if the world is real when it is kind of forceful on you. Now, that's an extreme example of the point I want to make, but if you never commit to something, really choose it and say, this is my world and this is what I am in, then you, of course, always feel like nothing is real because you don't have this kind of facticity that you're committed to that then gives you the feeling of reality. And one of the things Vervaeke and all them will talk about that's part of the meaning crisis is people don't feel like anything is real. Well, yeah, because one of the things you have to do to avoid that feeling is to commit to something. But here's the problem. You could commit to something bad. You could make a mistake. You really could. There has to be that risk. And we know that, but that's the tragedy of the human state. And there's more to be said on that. But you see, the point is you have to do a 2-act move. You have to imagine, and then you have to commit to one of those things and bear those other possibilities. If we get to a world where you are literally able to, on the deepest ontological level, design what you want, you are going to know of all the things you could have designed that you didn't design. And so the existential anxiety that you will have to cope with to do that will be extraordinary. And you'll have to bear it basically all your life because you'll have to stick to the commitment, right? And so there's a huge...
It's an irreversible process.
It's an irreversible process. That is why, unfortunately, Daniel Frege is... Exactly. Daniel Frege is emphasizing design or be designed. It's really frickin' hard to not let yourself be designed because that means you have to stay in that negativity space, basically, that space of that existential weight forever. But if we can manage to do that, we talked about before how in Hegel, the future is better or there is no future. It's a contingent future, right? It's either getting better, but if you screw it up, it's the worst of all possible worlds, right? There's no guarantee that we'll actually get to the technological singularity because we could all be nuked to death tomorrow, right? There's always those possibilities. But assuming that there is a future, it will probably look like X, Y, and Z. But it's very important to realize we're not determinate. It's not deterministic. It's more like a probabilistic necessity.
Žižek gives the example in Hegel and a Wired Brain with the idea that Neuralink is actually a possibility where we have people and mind control and a mass formation in a way we've never even seen before. So I think that's an example where he's just basically showing you or giving you I think a concrete example of why we need philosophy in this space of technological singularity, where he's not saying that Neuralink will lead to mind control. He's saying that when we think about these future technologies, which seem imminent and which seem to be going to be, you're going to have a fucking Apple store where you get a fucking chip in your head, that is a possibility. That's it seems like it could even be probable. Is we need to have philosophical thinking on what are all the ethical consequences of these technologies, and that is really like where we're currently lacking.
Well, speculative, to your point, speculative.
For example, in the PhD thesis, I talk about, like, for example, like, to give an example of how I do this with speculative thinking is, like, I basically say, okay, if we're going to have mass automation, then we need to think of some sort of common structure within within which mass automation occurs, or else you're going to have some ridiculous situations. Just to get, like, I think those are two concrete examples where, like, for the people who are still listening or like are actively working in this area, is like, you know, the basic principle is think about how radically the X technology changes certain socio-political situation, and then think about what we might need to actually counteract that in order to maximize the possibilities in a positive sense.
Well, speculative thought, which again, the word speculative is so othered. It's so like othered. It's not good. Speculative thought is always conditioning. It is always preparatory. Like, so for example, if we would have maybe speculated better about what it would be like to have a global pandemic and actually think it through and really think it, maybe there would have been a better response. That's another conversation, okay, right? You know, likewise, when you speculate before you're married, what exactly marriage will be. So, for example, ideas are practical. Ideas are insanely practical because all practice is through your idea of what you think is practical. You can't escape it. So, for example, if you go into marriage knowing that you're not going to find that primordial return to the womb, that instead you're going to encounter the essentialness of difference, then you make your metric the goal of a successful marriage, not a feeling of primordial oneness, but a feeling of harmony with difference that finds enough, you know, there has to be enough, you know, you can't get a harmony between, say, an instrument and an apple because they're too different, right? You know, right? But there has to be enough, so they both have to be instruments. You know, you need enough similarity in between two people to, like, you know, if someone's like obsessed with sports and you hate sports, that could be a problem. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it will be more difficult in a marriage. And actually, arguably, the challenge of increasing integration is having to find harmony between that level of difference, which we are not even close to being prepared for because we're not philosophically conditioned, because philosophy is always conditioning. Well, then when you go into a marriage going, okay, this person is similar enough to me, but there's also still radical difference there. A violin and a piano are radically different, even though they are both instrument and even though they both make music. And also the way you play them together is at different times. You don't play the same piano notes as the violin notes, or it's a really bad song. If you go into a marriage knowing that's the metric, then you don't become like pathological or upset when difference shows up, right? You're prepared for it. Philosophy has conditioned you to have a better outcome. And that's the same with the singularity. You know, the technological singularity. It's the same with society. If you do not have a society that is doing philosophy, and philosophy is always conditioning of the practical, because it is determining the ideas through which you define the practical. If you don't have a society doing that, in the name of practical, that's the joke. Is like, we don't condition ourselves in what we think is practical because we want to be practical people. And as a result, because irony is the fabric of reality, you know, basically we tend to be very good at irony. We're setting ourselves up for the singularity to be a kind of an effacement. And if quantum computing presents itself with the possibility of, say, new universes or different states of being, we won't have eyes to see that possibility because we will have conditioned ourselves not to look for it. And thus it will be the case, precisely because we will be creating the universe in a feedback loop, exactly as you said. Here's the thing. If feedback loops, as you're describing, are inescapable, then the choice is basically harmony or irony. There's basically two choices it will come down to, unless you can get rid of difference, which you can't, right? So if there's a feedback loop, there's either a learning to harmonize with deep difference that then creates new possibilities of harmony, but also new challenges of differences that then we learn to incorporate and keep going. Or you're going to end up in an irony where in the name of achieving X, you do Y, and Y is why you don't get X. The choice becomes irony or frickin' harmony, and a world without philosophy is going to end up in irony and not even have the idea to know what it has ended up in. It will be totally unable to access its own fate and understand it.
But and I think maybe, I don't know if we've discussed this, but like potentially interesting is like maybe the difference between Descartes and Hegel is like Descartes is the individual philosopher who becomes mad in relationship to society, but that Hegel is the philosopher who sees the madness in common society. It's like, you know, like, like tries to, like, one of like the principles of the phenomenology of spirit is that he's trying to intellectualize things which we are, but we take for granted. Like what is sense certainty? Like, what is that? Or like what is a parent-child relationship, or a boss-worker relationship? What is that? Like things that we all deal with in common life, basically common life. But like, that's where the philosophy really is. Like it's like you really have to make sense of that. So like basically things that people take for granted, like a lighter, like there's absolutely interesting things everywhere, like and like that's like one of like the biggest shifts in me in like becoming a philosopher, or like becoming more philosophically centered, is like almost everything anyone says to me, like almost everything I see, like when I wake up, like is potentially intriguing and interesting and like infinitely fascinating. Like that you can have deep philosophical insight. Like I mean I like yeah, I mean it's just everywhere, like philosophy is everywhere.
Well, you know, I think Todd McGowan in his book on emancipating Hegel, where he talks about the difference between Heidegger and Hegel, was really good. Where Heidegger's like he's going to go off to the forest to think, where Hegel's invited to the university, goes into the university. Where Heidegger is like, well, if I go to the university, I'll be distracted and I won't be able to have deep thoughts. So he goes to the Black Forest. Where Hegel's like, no, I have to go into it, because and that, of course, as you know,
he's in it.
He's in it. And for me, you know, I get into the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume and Vico and all these different things. Another way I always like to put it, for Descartes, you get to truth by, you know, the way I put, like for Descartes, he's kind of like, I think in a letter, he says something like this, where he says, if I couldn't see, if I couldn't smell, if I couldn't touch, I'd be closest to truth. You know, whereas if I take someone like
actually, you know, the reverse.
It's the reverse. It's exactly. I like how,
and that's because that's something that Hegel makes clear in the phenomenology of spirit, right at the beginning of sense certainty, is like, it's kind of like there's this temptation to skip the entire dialectical process and like try to get to some truth without sense.
Well, in truth without sense is sameness without difference. You're basically saying that if we could get a state where there's no sense, which is basically to get rid of difference, because sense is the kind of tracing out of different kinds of difference. Well, then it's the impulse. That's right.
Because when you go through it, it's remarkable to read the chapter on absolute knowing, where he's basically recapitulating the dialectical process and like containing it within itself. But like it's like that absolute knowing is not a state without sense.
Exactly.
No, there's sense there.
Well, and for me, I sometimes wonder with Descartes' thinking there, if there's something kind of like a death drive. And what I mean by that is, and Ayn Rand said this somewhere, where she's like, you know, it takes the genius of a Michelangelo or whoever to make a statue of David, lots of time, lots of skill, but any brute can come on and destroy it, right? It can take 2 seconds to destroy a great work of art. Daniel L. Garner, could go and burn down the Sistine Chapel if I could get through security. Anyone could basically do it, and then I could be drunk, I could be an idiot, anyone could do it, but it takes incredible genius and work to create the Sistine Chapel. Similarly, I can stab my eyes out. I can cut my nose off pretty easily. But the idea of conditioning my sight to see blue as truly blue, to really see the world and to centrally take it in, that sounds like a ton of work. I don't know what to do with all that. Where do I even begin? But a negative, like Descartesian view, is easier, actually. There's something incredibly easier, but it sounds so humble. It sounds so like, oh man, it sounds so like, yeah, it's like humble and well, reductionist. In the same way that when people go, oh, I could never be an artist, right? I could never create that. There's something humble about that, but the problem is those same people will tell you that art is a waste of time, right? Those same people will turn around and treat creativity like it doesn't matter. So there's a humility, but it's actually hiding a kind of death drive and a kind of destruction and an avoiding of complexity. So, you know, likewise, when you're like, oh man, I could get to truth if I couldn't see, if I couldn't smell, and blah, 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 there's actually a hidden sort of like, your brain is like, yeah, I don't want to do that work. So
the thing is that if you're hiding, the problem with the death drive is if you're hiding it.
That's right.
Because otherwise, like if you're not hiding, if you're aware of it, it's actually the motor of creativity.
And this is the weird, I was talking with Mr. Ebert about, it's this weird thing where the difference between a death drive and like death in a good way is integration with it and acceptance with it.
Yeah.
It's like this weird thing where it's not, because, you know, it's like, you don't, death has a really critical role, right? But it's almost like, I always love coming up with terms. I'm almost at the point where I always want to call the death drive the effacement drive or something, because, you know, I'm obsessed now with the term effacement because I find it a useful distinction between negation and effacement. Yeah. But then once you do that, you lose the association with Freud, and, you know, and you want that because of all of that. But there's something where the funny thing is exactly what you're saying, is that the death drive.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Precisely when you own it, then becomes
that distinction matters. Yeah, that distinction matters.
And so I was
just gonna say, like, because like if you think about,
my goal is to keep you up till 1 a.m, by the way. So you know that's my goal. But please.
But like I was just gonna say, like, because if you take like the conclusions of like this work seriously, and like where we're actually heading is some sort of speculative design space where you can like actually you can design worlds and processes. Potentially. Right. I mean, like if I'm concretely presented or find myself in that environment or situation, well, that does mean that Cadell as I know him now is going to die.
Right.
Like Cadell as I know him will not be that, you know.
That's right.
Cadell as I know him will be as different as Cadell when I was 5 years old, or I mean, maybe that analogy doesn't work, but like Cadell as I know me now is not doing that. It's a totally different Cadell.
Right.
So, or maybe it's not even Cadell. Maybe it's even that maybe it's so different that what I think of as Cadell is itself different.
Right.
Right. So like that's the difference between like, whereas like with the, like that's sort of like where you get into the usefulness of negation.
Right.
But like with the effacement drive, it's kind of like you imagine you're not there while you're there. Like, yep. Like, so for example, like I might Irony. Even say like someone like Kurzweil is in that situation because like, you know, and I really like Kurzweil, so I'm not putting it, and this
sure, I understand.
There's nothing against Kurzweil, but like, it's like the whole imagining of, you know, like a utopian possibility space of technology is kind of like at the same time erasing what's going on in your concrete life right now, like, and working on that in your concrete life right now. Like, so like that fantasy in some sense is an effacement, and maybe even hiding a death drive. So like, for example, like what I've said before in podcasts is that what's really interesting is that if you ask Kurzweil about his fantasies of technological singularity, some of them involve being a woman and experiencing sexuality from the point of view of a woman. And I was like, well, that's like super, like, that's again, like, okay, well, all of a sudden Freud and technological singularity are super interesting. It's like, but where is that? Like, why aren't, like, just because of that fact, like, of your fantasies and your fiction structures in your head as it relates to singularity, like, why isn't there actually more interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work between, like, for example, AI and psychoanalysis? Like, all of a sudden that's interesting. Like, all of a sudden there's a huge new field. No, like,
you know, we really do not. I think what you're getting at is so big because you transform. I mean, it's what Frege is saying. I mean, if you give a kid a new toy, for example, you transform who the kid is. It's deep. Like when you give Reed, a 2-year-old, a shovel or a screwdriver, he is a mechanic.
I remember the day my mom surprised me and my brother with Super Nintendo. Okay,
that's hilarious.
I remember that day.
Oh yeah,
I was not the same kid.
No, once I discovered Chrono Trigger, once I discovered Final Fantasy VI, it was done. I was not the same person. My entire life of living in the woods was probably a result of me playing something like Chrono Trigger on the Super Nintendo and going in the woods to imagine my sort of tribulation story. That was thanks to that. Entirely different person. Exactly right. And if anyone hears this knows what Chrono Trigger is, I'm there with you. I'm really there with you. I can't hear that opening intro song without getting chills. But the point is that this is what we don't appreciate. Okay, so if you have the ability to make any world you want to make, then you also have to bear the weight of knowing you chose X instead of Y, knowing that other people know you chose X instead of Y, you knowing that they know you could have done something different, and all of the extraordinary tension that brings. For me, one of the most eye-opening experiences is, in fact, creating like a short story and putting it in the world, or making a business and putting it in the world, and encountering the radical cruelty of people. People are so mean. Yeah. When it comes to like what you've made or what you've done. You've got like 800 pages, grammatically perfect, the story is great, and all they talk about is the 2 grammar errors you have on page 50. And all they do is sit around and like critique it. They're just mean. People are not nice.
No, and you see people are not nice.
People are not nice, and especially when it comes to creativity. There's something about a creative act, if we use that phrase, that brings out the worst in people. One, because it probably reflects on them that they're not creative. 2, they're like, why did you do that? Who do you think you are to create something? Like, there is a radical pathological response to creation that is very cruel. And the ontological design,
interesting idea to think.
In ontological design, that's going to be times 1,000. And if the average person doesn't even have the experience of having their short story stomped on, are they ready to have their world stomped on? Are they ready to have their new sexual identity stomped on? Are they ready for that without philosophy? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. And that's why, unfortunately, you were talking about the possibility of people making their own worlds ontologically and so on and so forth. I like to talk about the differences between soloing, singularity, and harmony. Okay, soloing is when one guy's practicing his violin in his room over here, someone down the street is practicing their cello over there, someone down the street further is practicing piano. Everyone's soloing, they're separated. Harmony is just an orchestra where you have the piano, the cellos, the strings, the flutes, there's difference, and it makes possible harmony. But guess what? Because there's difference, the person playing violin can look at the pianist and say, who does he think he is? Oh man, I wish I played, he gets all the attention because he gets these solos. And then the flutes could be like, nobody cares about the flutes. All they do is care about the violin. Because there's difference, there's existential reflection.
Like in every rock band, right?
Yeah, exactly right. Singularity, as I'm defining it here, is where everyone in the orchestra plays violin. Everyone plays the same instrument. Well, there's no existential tension. The music sucks. Because it's all violin, but there's no existential tension because everyone's the same.
Nothing against the violin.
Of course. Michelle plays violin. I better not have anything against the violin. So the thing is, right now, we seem to be, in a kind of Freudian way, convincing ourselves that an orchestra where everyone plays the same instrument, like we're approaching the singularity like it's going to be everyone plays violin, and that is possible and not be missing out on something. And of course, if everyone's playing the violin, that's like totalitarianism, right? Everyone's forced to be the same and so on and so forth. There's no existential tension, but there's also a loss of beauty and all of these, and also like difference. And arguably the singularity, as I've so described it, is impossible because humans are deeply different. Well, that gives us two options basically for the future. Harmony? Well, there's 3. There's the effacement. We could indeed, of course, be effaced. But a future where we're not effaced is either going to be soloing or harmony, okay? Because of the incredible existential tension of creation, like I was describing, we are going to naturally go in the direction of soloing. It will be very difficult for us not to create our own ontological design worlds per se, and not try to also be isolationist with it, where we're not inviting the other into it because of the existential difficulty of the creative act on that scale. The likelihood of achieving a harmony, which is an incorporation of the other, will require radical levels of philosophical training, conditioning, psychological conditioning, and so on and so forth, which we haven't even thought as a society of the idea that we even need to do that. And so we are basically just kind of lollygagging, or I don't know, going in the direction of soloing or totalitarianism, because it's what Mr. Frege says. If we don't do the designing, we're going to be designing. What's going to happen is the forces that be will just design us into whatever single instrument that they want, that they can algorithmically calculate, to make us intelligible, delusion capture and all that, and then control. If we're not going to end up that way, we need to get to work. We need to get to work right now. And it revolves conditioning, which I think philosophy is a field that does it so well, where you are at peace with conflicts of mind, dare I say. You actually view limitation as the key to creativity. You view you find different worlds neat. And then I'll give it back to you. And I guess it's about 2 in the morning. I don't know what time it is. I'm just really good at keeping you up because the work you do is so important. So I don't want to stop talking to you. It's like people who do creative work are able to receive the creative work of one another and find a good balance between accepting, critiquing, building. People who do it have a different emotional disposition when they create a different work. Like artists treat one another differently because they understand the difficulty of the creative work. Entrepreneurs treat each other differently because they understand the difficulty of the entrepreneurial work. Likewise, that's why I guess I keep stressing conditioning. A world of coming ontological design where you have familiarity with the difficulty of radical choice and creation is a world that will treat one another better, that will have a better understanding of all the existential weights and difficulties that come with it, and thus be conditioned in a manner that increases the likelihood that you get a harmony as opposed to just everyone wanting to kill one another because they're so hurt and attacked. So the conditioning, I think, is just completely radically important.
Well, these ideas might be a good place to sort of bring it to a conclusion, at least for this conversation, and
Yes.
and maybe, open it up in a different thread another time. But like this idea that where the speculative design creative space leads you is ultimately you have to contain the deepest pathos that people don't want to kill each other.
That's right.
And this idea that actually at the ground of the creative space you have this hidden death drive. I think that's basically Freud's point about anthropology and the origin of the family.
Absolutely.
Is that you have the desire to kill the father and you have the desire to attach to the givenness of the mother. And that when we talk about designing new worlds, well, the person who creates is the father and the world you're losing is the mother, metaphorically.
Absolutely.
So these metaphors do hold some weight, and they can be applied in this sense. And so the idea that we have to go through the entire sort of phenomenological journey,
yep,
and all of the tensions of our mind in order to be the type of knower that can exist in this world, is, I think, the society of absolute knowers. This is an enormous challenge, and I think it's probably, that's where I find myself in my work. I teach right now. I'm teaching Hegel. I'm finding that this work does feed back into my previous work in a meaningful way. I don't know where it's going to take me, but I think that's a feature of knowing my limit and knowing that I can't really jump ahead of myself.
With Hegel,
right. Sort of be patient with myself. I'm watching my thought. I'm trying to anticipate where I might be able to think against myself next. But I also don't want to rush myself. And I suppose it's those. I mean, I guess I might even say that being around similar types of individuals is in some sense a precondition for being able to achieve that type of existential tension. There is, like you were giving that, then maybe that's the final point I'll make, is that you were giving the example of you can have so much difference that the harmony is impossible, right? And you can have so much sameness that you can't really have any meaningful creative tension. So on the one hand, I think the deconstructionist end of philosophy leads to too much difference to the point where we can't create anything. And the sort of scientific naturalism, which focuses on givens, has too much sameness, which eradicates even the existence of the creative subject. And I think that's why you have the tensions with sort of bringing sexuality into the conversation as a creative energy and a creative force. And also like existential tension, right? Like confronting like your death, like, that's you, So I think that's where I'd end things.
Well, Mr. Dr. Cadell, absolutely excellent.
Mr. Doctor.
Yeah, Doctor. I said Mr. Doctor. Is that a
Mr.
thing?
Doctor.
Well, that's an example of a new
whenever someone calls Žižek, whenever someone calls Žižek Doctor, he says, "What did I do to you? Did I kill your mother?" Or something like that?
That's really funny. Well, you know, so much like on what you're saying, as we approach the technological singularity, it will be unveiled the impossibility of a complete sense-making. Instead, what will be unveiled is the need to entertain something like absolute knowing, the acceptance of limits. And if we cannot do that, well, then we're going to have trouble. We're probably going to undergo effacement. And the necessity of conditioning ourselves now in such a manner that we are preparing for that and aware of that is to come to terms with our finitude. It's almost like we think that the moment of technological singularity will be the moment that unveils that we in our finitude can become infinite, when actually it will just be the moment that really unveils that we're finite, like super finite. And we're not ready for that. And now if we come to terms with that, we can then have a new difference of this technology, to speak generally, that we can then harmonize with. But that's going to require the ability to have our difference brought out, which of course then gets into death and the death of the finitude and all these different things, and coming to terms with that, which if we come to terms with that, you could have that negation that comes with experience of finitude as such could open new possibilities, new doors, new sublimations. That would be where the meaning crisis, in fact, does blossom into hope or something more, because we rise to the occasion, because we arise to new ways of thinking that we can make the most of it. And your work, Dr. Last, is greatly contributing to that. It is contributing to that effort. It has a view from the airplane of the whole, that how the territory comes together, that brings that, you know, the other thing about that I always loved in that airplane, when you look down at these common lives, these spaces of common life that people are living, and you see it as a whole, it looks like a painting, and it's beautiful, and it's beautiful to look at, and it's beautiful to see your work, because your work is beautiful. So thank you for what you do, Dr. Cadell Last. It is a pleasure and an honor. Thank you, sir. All
right. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thanks for having this conversation. And it's I guess that, yeah, the final thing I'll say is it's I mean, it's maybe even singular that someone has engaged my doctoral thesis to that level before, and it's definitely helped me to think it in a new way. So thank you.
It's been an honor and a pleasure, Cadell. Thank you, sir.